Transactional distance is a broad theory which aims to describe and define elements of the pedagogy of distance education. Transactional distance was originally described as a psychological and communication space to be crossed, a space of potential misunderstanding between the inputs of the instructor and those of the learner. More recently, it has been summarized as the gap between the understanding of the teacher or teaching team and that of the learner. This gap being not simply physical, but also psychological and interactional. In other words, a lack of shared knowledge or feeling of communal misunderstanding. Moore identified three interrelated macro factors within transactional distance: dialogue, structure, and learner autonomy, which work together to determine the relative gap in understanding. Initially, Moore's work concentrated on the interaction between teachers and learners. This has since been expanded to include learner-learner, learner content, and learner interface interactions, thereby holistically considering the learner's connections to each other, academic staff, and the learning materials and platform. In Moore's words, the aim of transactional distance theory is to build a bridge between the learner's understanding and those charged with helping the learner develop their knowledge. Dialogue and structure are the main elements in the transactional distance model that are within the control of the instructional designer and teaching staff. Dialogue is defined in this theory as a specific type of constructive interaction which involves the exchange of information and growth of understanding. It includes all methods and means of communication included in the learner-teacher and learner-learner interactions. The quality of the exchange, as well as the availability of opportunity for exchange, is important when defining dialogue within the theory. Therefore, each communicator should be as skilled at communicating as they are at using the medium of communication. Structure is defined as the overall plan and content of a course or program of study, including how and to what level of detail these elements are organized. This covers the learner content and the learner interface elements of interaction. As with dialogue, structure is able to be shaped by the program design and is heavily correlated with the communication media utilized in the course. These two elements, dialogue and structure, can be plotted on a simple graph where when one element increases, the other is required to decrease. For example, a course with more structure requires less dialogue but increases the transactional distance. More flexible structures require more dialogue but decrease the transactional distance. Autonomy is the third element of transactional distance and is required to complete the theory. This allows for the inclusion and consideration of the learner's own abilities to manage and direct their learning. This element is in the hands of the learner, and in comparison to structure and dialogue is much more difficult for the teacher to control when designing the course. Autonomy can be broken down into two smaller elements: the learner's independence of learning, which relates to their comfort with self-directed work, and their study habits, which considers planning and efficacy. This is plotted on the z-axis of the graph and gives us an illustration of how much autonomy is required for a program or course relative to the structural flexibility and level of dialogue. As Moore discusses, programs of study with relatively less transactional distance may be more appealing to learners with less academic confidence. Conversely, programs with more experience, higher level learners would require less dialogue and learners would be able to abide a greater transactional distance. Transactional distance is a widely recognized learning theory. However, Moore's definition of transactional distance has been interpreted in a number of ways, many of which are not inclusive of all the theoretical elements. One significant issue with the theory is the idea that transactional distance may be close to impossible to corroborate due to the main correlation being between dialogue and transactional distance. This is described by some as a tautology, in which either element may be used to describe the other, i.e. transactional distance is a lack of dialogue and vice versa. This argument, however, may not take into account the inclusion of learner autonomy, or perhaps would rearrange the theory as a simple graph with autonomy on one axis and the flexibility of structure on the other. The bisecting line then becomes the required level of dialogue or transactional closeness. Another issue with autonomy was raised with Moore's early work, where researchers asked whether flexible learning structures necessitate increased dialogue. This is somewhat addressed in Moore's more recent publications, where less structured, flexible study is described as offering opportunities for learners to find their own ways to meet the learning outcomes. This, however, suggests that learner autonomy could increase alongside or instead of dialogue. These issues do not appear to be well addressed in the literature and suggest that dialogue and autonomy can be moderated somewhat independent of structure, which highlights the ongoing issues with operationalizing transactional distance and calls into question the utility of transactional distance as a predictive model. However, a tool has been developed with the potential to improve and inform program design and delivery by qualitatively measuring the learner's perceived transactional distance. This may assist in pinpointing areas of focus for teachers and instructional designers, as well as providing a firm basis for the theory in future studies. Despite these issues, transactional distance is still considered an important theory in the development of quality distance education. While advances in technology allow for many new avenues of dialogue and connection, it is often tempting when developing learning for large cohorts to introduce more autonomous time and self-directed activities and minimize dialogue. However, the consideration of the learner's level of autonomy and ability to manage their own study should not be forgotten. This understanding is required when constructing distance learning courses which take transactional distance into consideration. Learners' academic background and experience with self-directed study, technology, and learning management systems should all be taken into account. The interaction between dialogue, structure, and autonomy should not be viewed as prescriptive, but as an understanding, and if one element is lacking, then the other may need to be improved or optimized. This allows for a balance rather than an elimination of transactional distance. There are a number of ways to visualize this. One method of visualization for relative transactional distance is to see the elements of the theory as building blocks in a course. These blocks, when stacked on top of each other, must reach a certain height to be considered effective learning. Each type of block is required for every program of study, but the ratio of blocks must be reconsidered for every course. This shows the potential variety of methodologies of delivery available when designing a course and helps highlight the equifinality available when transactional distance is taken into account in the distance learning environment. It may also be helpful to think of each block as timed elements and ask these questions. How much content will need to be created to cover the learning outcomes, and how long will it take to assimilate? How much time should each learner be expected to interact with the learning team and other learners? And how much time should they be spending on their own studies and assessments? Another way to visualize this theory is to return to Moore's analogy, where transactional distance can be viewed as a bridge which crosses a gulf of understanding between the learner and tutorial staff. Imagine that the bridge is supported by three piers, one for each element of transactional distance: autonomy, structure, and dialogue. New learners aren't going to have much experience, so they will not be able to build their autonomy pier very far out and will need more support from other elements. For example, a lower level undergraduate or introductory course with inexperienced learners might require more dialogue, a flexible structure, and sacrifice learner autonomy to meet these needs. More experienced learners, on the other hand, can help by building more of the bridge from their end, using their well-developed study habits and independent learning skills, thus reducing the need for supportive dialogue and structure, so a higher level postgraduate or capstone course with experienced learners may have minimal dialogue, rigid structure, and significant autonomous elements. As online courses gain popularity and learner cohorts expand, the learning team's time is likely to be stretched. This is where learner-learner connections, like discussion boards and reciprocal learning, can be included in the program. These can increase dialogue and reduce transactional distance while minimizing workload for frontline staff. It may be tempting to include group projects in distance learning situations to minimize transactional distance, but this has been shown to negatively impact learner autonomy. So consideration should be given to how these elements should be balanced in the course. Cohorts are also changing. Non-traditional, over 25, part-time learners with motivations that extend beyond their career are becoming the norm. Careful consideration of this diversity in background and capabilities is recommended in distance learning course creation. If enough space is allowed for dialogue and structural flexibility, diversity can lead to insights that would not have been available in more rigidly structured courses. This can be achieved by integrating opportunities for inclusion of the learner's context and utilizing multiple communication and assessment methods within the course. In conclusion, there are many ways to build a bridge between the understandings of the learners and of the teachers, which consider and allow for appropriate levels of dialogue, structure, and autonomy. When applying the theory of transactional distance to the development of distance education, it is important not to try to define transactional distance as a discrete quantity, rather to view it as a relative value value. Therefore, courses should not be thought of as either having transactional distance or not having transactional distance. They should be considered as having comparatively more or less transactional distance. When these elements are viewed with this mindset, then understanding can be gained as to in which direction improvement lies.